Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. And today in Fish and Wildlife Management, we're going to talk about one of the main jobs of a fisheries or wildlife scientist or manager. And that is determining or evaluating or manipulating, and in some cases, just classifying how a population is doing. Okay, so we're going to talk about a concept called population dynamics. We're just going to skim over the top of population dynamics. It's much more complex, or can be much more complex, than what I'm going to give you today. But this will give you kind of an overview of what a population biologist or a manager would do when they're examining populations. We'll talk about how you get numbers for the population. But let's say we already have the numbers for the populations, and we're going to dive into what is that population doing? Is it growing, shrinking? Are individuals, you know, are they leaving the area for food resources or reproductive resources and not coming back? Or is there a group of individuals that can't reproduce? These kind of things is why we look at population dynamics from a wildlife standpoint. All right, so first, let's dive into a little bit of definitions. What is a population? A population is a group of organisms, has to be the same species, occupying the same place, same time, and have the opportunity to reproduce. Often that have the opportunity to reproduce is added in for fish and wildlife managers because they're interested in that piece. A population in general doesn't have to reproduce with itself. So you could have a summer population of an organism, a winter population of an organism, and in both those time periods, they may not reproduce. Maybe they only reproduce in the spring, and so you'd want to know, well, what's the spring population and where's it at, and how many individuals are reproducing. And that would be important for things like migratory birds, ducks, geese, those kind of things. They often are, overwintering someplace. They might even they might even summer or fall in a different region, and then they spring in a different region. And most of the time they're reproducing in spring, and that give managers where the birds are reproducing a different population dynamics than managers where the birds are just roosting or feeding in the summer or winter time. Okay, so population. So density plays a large role in population. So we're often interested not just in the number of individuals, but how densely are they packed in a given environment. So density like 20 blue geese, okay, or 20 blue grouse, or 20 blue herons. It doesn't really matter what the organism is. Okay, if we're examining that and we want to know what the population is, we're often interested in what's the density. So then we have to have a number of individuals, number of rainbow trout, whatever it might be, per a given area. Okay, per given hectare, per given acre, per given square meters. Okay, so it's really just up to the management unit what you're interested in. It's pretty simple in regards to some things like fish in a lake, fish in a pond, something like that. But it can be very difficult for things that have huge home ranges like elk and deer and other organisms that might migrate a very long distance, or even more so, migratory birds, the ducks, things like that. They can move huge distances and they don't stay in a region for very long. So a density measurement can be very difficult to get on that. But that's way more meaningful than just a population number. In the population also goes birth rate. Okay? We're often interested in the number of individuals that are, added to the population via birth. Okay? And this could be a birth rate that we represent as number of births per 1,000 individuals, 110, or even number of individuals per year. So it really depends on what organism we're talking about. If we're talking about something like salmon, cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, brook trout, brown trout, something like that, then we're probably going to represent that as number of births per 1,000 or at least per 100. Okay? But if we're talking about elk or moose or bear, we might be representing that of number of births per 10 individuals, maybe even number of births in a given year by single digits, like how many new offspring were added that year. Depends on the population size. Death rate, okay? The number of individuals that die per year, or you can, represent that as a different number, as per 1,000 individuals, how many are you expecting to die per given year, that kind of thing. So some of this might be hard data, and it's a definite death rate, so we actually know exactly how many organisms are dying. And that's the case with certain things like endangered species. We know the exact count. We know exactly how many organisms there are in a given region. Take Devil's Hole pupfish. Okay, Devil's Hole is a little pool of water, and only in one region. It's in between the Nevada and California, and there's a fish that lives there called the Devil's Hole pupfish, and it's probably the most endangered. It's definitely the most endangered fish, but it's probably the most endangered vertebrate on the planet. Well, it lives in one pool of water, and we know exactly how many there are because we can count them. So in that case, the death rate is a definite. I mean, you know exactly how many organisms there are, right? But let's take, say a run of salmon, okay, that is coming off the Columbia River, okay, and you might have multiple runs that are coming up the Columbia River, going to different side streams and things like that. In that case, you're not going to have a definite count. You're not going to have a definite death rate. So you might represent the death rate as a percent of the population. This is what we would assume is going to die each year, and this is based on recapture rates and things like that. We'll talk about capture, recapture rates. We'll talk about techniques like that in a later lecture. All right, so often it's not enough to just know what the population is doing, but you also want to know what's the population consisted of. Okay? Is it just a bunch of old individuals and there's no new reproduction or young individuals in the population? Or is it a bunch of young individuals and no organism lives past the age of 2 or 3? Okay, so you need to know the age structure. So an age structure is the distribution of individuals at the various ages. I'll talk about what it means to age something also in later lectures. You got to realize that with some organisms, it's really easy to get an age. For things like fish, okay, you can get a definite age. You can get a number of years, okay, and even more specifically than that, if you use hard parts that are inside their head called otoliths, you can get even half years, a quarter year, even less than that. So you can get months. As far as other things like birds and most mammals, you're just classifying them as an age class. So it might be they're between 1 and 3. They're between 3 and 5. Okay? And so it's much more difficult in some of the other organisms to classify them. And that really has to do with something that we call continuous growth. So all ectotherms have continuous growth. So they grow throughout their entire life. And so their body parts also grow throughout their entire life. Their hard parts, their bones, and things like that. So it makes it easy for researchers to examine that and see that growth. For things like birds and mammals, as we know, because we are a mammal, we stop growing after a certain period. Okay, so it's kind of discontinuous growth. And so because you stop growing, it's harder to age organisms to a definite age that stop growing because less material is being put onto those bones and stuff like that. They just stop adding material. We'll come back to this because it's important that I teach you some techniques for aging different organisms. Another thing that you might be interested in a population is the sex ratio. So how many or what portion of the population is male, what portion is female, and is the ratio correct for what you're managing for? Are you managing for population growth? So you want to up the numbers. Okay? Then you want, depending on how the organisms reproduce, but if it's a 1-for-1 reproduction, then you want basically the same number of males as you do females. If it's a system where there's a harem or a system where there's a single male and that male can mate with multiple females, well, you need to know how many females does a male typically have in that region, and then you want to manage for that. Okay, 1 male for every 3 females, or if it's a very rich system, maybe 1 male for every 6 or for every 10 females, and that will give you kind of that sex ratio that you want to go for. Okay? So again, it's a ratio of males to females, and for most organisms, it's fairly easy to tell. We will talk about some organisms that are difficult to tell what the sex are. Okay? So they're not sexually dimorphic. There's no difference between males and females. And there's probably a few of you out there that are like, oh, yeah, I can't tell the difference between a male goose, Canada goose, and a female Canada goose. This is true. Unless you have the bird in hand, you can't tell the difference. If you do have a goose or even a duck out of the season or something like that in hand, you can probe their cloaca and see if they have a penis. So there are ways to get sex ratio of organisms that are not sexually dimorphic, but there are some that are not sexually dimorphic, and it would entail you cutting them open to see how many males and females, or whether it's a male or female. So there is a difficult piece there, and we'll talk about some of those situations where it's just not possible without killing the organism or using something like ultrasound or something like that, and scanning the organism. Fecundity is another one. Okay? So fecundity is the number of offspring that is produced by a female, or basically the potential offspring that's produced by a female. Or fecundity also can represent the number of sperm that's produced by a male. But most of the time, we're not worried about sperm. Sperm is cheap. Sperm is often produced, males produce way more sperm than they could ever use. So normally what we're interested when it comes to fecundity is the number of eggs that a female can produce and for how long. Now, in some instances, if we're talking about fish, we could be talking about thousands of offspring, potential offspring, per breeding season. If we're talking about deer, elk, moose, depends on the region, but in some cases it's 1 a year with the occasional twin. In other regions, it might be due to, a lack of diet. It could be every other year or every 3 years that they reproduce. And so fecundity is really that number that is potential for the female to reproduce. The other piece of that is just because a fish can reproduce 3,000 eggs doesn't mean that all 3,000 are going to hatch or all 3,000 can be fertilized, or even if the stream bottom or wherever the eggs are being laid has high enough quality of oxygen and water or gravel or silt, whatever it might be that's needed in that region. Maybe it's not high enough quality. So it really doesn't matter if the female could produce 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 eggs. Only 10% are going to hatch. Okay, but that's part of the fecundity that plays a role in that population dynamics. Production is much like fecundity. Okay, so we need to know how many of the offspring are being produced. So you produce this many of eggs. This is how many are going to be fertilized. This is how many are going to hatch. That's how many offspring are going to be reproduced or produced. Okay, but also you have to think about, well, is there recruitment going on? Okay, so are you recruiting individuals into that breeding population? Are they making it to the breeding age? Or is it being delayed? Is it being delayed due to habitat conditions? Is it being delayed due to increased stress? These kind of things. So just because an organism can produce a certain number or have a fecundity of a certain number and then have a production of a certain number doesn't mean that they're going to do that in every habitat. The habitat dictates a lot on what or how many organisms are going to make it to the next generation, and definitely how many are going to make it into the recruitment stage or the breeding age. All right, so population dynamics, again, like I said before, it's really just studying how things change over time. And so often with population dynamics, you have to have a baseline. So you have to have best case scenario situations where you're like, okay, this is how many organisms can be supported by the habitat. This is how many predators there are out there. This is how many they're going to consume, etc. So you have this best case scenario, and then you have to tweak things. Okay, well, we didn't get enough water. We have too many predators, have too many hunters. Okay, or introduced a new species into this region. They're losing habitat. These kind of things play a huge role in population dynamics. Okay? And that's what a lot of managers do. They try to predict what's going to happen to the population. And clearly, as a wildlife manager, if humans are part of that ecosystem in the sense that they're taking or culling off, killing organisms for food resources or sport or whatever it might be, they play a portion of this population dynamics. They play a big role in that. Right? If the organism is protected, okay, then humans, most of the time, they don't play a role in studying, what's happening to the organisms, unless there's humans out there trying to destroy the protected organism, which happens, and we'll talk about situations where that happens. Okay, population structure can be and often is part of population dynamics. Okay? In order to study how numbers or the biomass of an organism is changing over time, often you need to know what's the structure of the population. What's its size? What's its age structure? Its sex ratio? Sometimes you're interested in other things like maybe a size structure, meaning like what is the length, like total length of these organisms. So maybe you broke it off into a total length of 0 to 3 inches, 3 inches to 6 inches, 6 inches to 12 inches. Maybe you're going to do a slot for fish, and you say, all right, anything between 6 and 12 you have to throw back because that's reproductive size. Anything below that you could keep. Don't know why you would, but you can keep and eat it. Anything above 12 inches you could keep 1. There's a lot of slot limits like that, and that's part of that population structure. And normally that's based on a size, sex kind of relationship or size age kind of relationship, where the organism reaches peak maturity peak fecundity numbers at a certain size, so you want to protect them during that size. Once they're over that, their eggs or sperm start to decrease. They're kind of on the downhill as far as reproduction, and they can be taken from the population without changing the population's numbers. Most of you have probably heard of things like predator-prey cycles. Probably the best example of predator-prey cycle that's out there currently is, the snowshoe hare and the lynx. And we've known about this cycle for a very, very long time. Now, there are deviations to this cycle. It's not always cyclic like you see here on kind of a perfect pattern where if the snowshoe hare increases, follow that with an increase in the lynx, and you get a decrease in the snowshoe hare. Then that causes the lynx to crash, and then you get snowshoe hare rebound, then lynx rebounds, then the snowshoe hare crashes, then the lynx crashes. And so it's this back and forth, predator prey, give and take kind of situation. And they're not always perfect like that. But lynx and hare populations do fluctuate in a cycle like this, and they have been doing so for a very long time. Often, populations that do this and that are very cyclic is because lynx are only feeding on hares. Okay? They're not feeding on any other prey in a given region. That is their key prey item. And when their populations are high, the lynx belly is full and they can reproduce, and that lynx population is going to increase. When the lynx population increases, the hares are more vulnerable. There's more predation. The hare population is going to decrease. Okay. Other times you have other factors that are going on. Okay. So, for example, this is also a fairly classic example. This is wolves and moose, and this is on a island outside or a little bit of ways away from Michigan, okay, called the Island Royale or Isles Royale, and there's been moose there for a while. We believe that they swam across the water to get onto the island. They've been there for a while, and the wolves actually followed them. Okay? And so the wolves came to the island, most likely from swimming. We don't think anybody introduced either one there. But what happens is we've been tracking the moose population and the wolf population for a while. So you can see wolves are in red and moose are in blue. And at first, as the moose population increased, you could see a pretty sharp increase in the wolves population. And then the moose decreased, and so did the wolves. And then the moose increased. But what we haven't seen is the wolves haven't really recovered. The wolves aren't exploding again. So unlike the cycles that you see in the lynx hare, there's something else going on in this population. It's not just a single predator-prey model where the moose increase, predators increase, prey decrease, predators decrease. And that's not the case. Something else is going on. We think this actually has to do with diseases, because we're talking about a very small habitat. It's one island that, as the wolves increased, they increased the infection rate of certain diseases, and that's kind of keeping this population lower, because when the population is too high, the disease outbreak runs rampant and starts killing them off. This is not a good thing for the island's vegetation, because as the moose population escapes the wolves and the moose population is exploding, they're eating all the island's vegetation. Now, the nice thing is cycles work from plants and herbivores. So as the moose eat all the vegetation, eventually that population will crash because there's no food. And then you might see the wolves also crash because they don't have any food. And then the plant community will return, and maybe the wolves and moose will make it back to the island if they're extirpated off the island. But maybe their numbers are just high enough to maintain numbers on the island until the vegetation comes back, and then they'll come back. So that's a nice thing, or kind of neat thing about population dynamics, is often it's more than just predator prey. It's more than a single predator, single prey. It's often a lot of pieces. And that's what makes it very difficult. So when people say, well, I don't understand why game and fish are only allowing 100 tags when there's so many elk in this region, or there's so many big deer in this region. Some of that has to do with their models say, hey, we need to be conservative on the number of organisms that we're going to allow taken out of this area, because this area is subjected to, range animals coming through. So maybe you get sheep, or maybe you get cattle that come through and eat up some of the vegetation. Maybe you have regions where they're very susceptible to drought. And if you have a big drought cycle, you'll have a huge crash in the population. So often game and fish managers, they're thinking about the really big picture. And it's not these predator prey cycles. So you don't have kind of this simple cycle. Sometimes it's really complex and you don't know what's going on. All right, so a lot of this work, a lot of this population dynamics go really back to a guy named Malthus. And Malthus wrote a book in 1798 on human populations. And Malthus stated in his populations book that humans are capable of over-reproduction, and that they can reproduce more offspring than there is food available for that population. So remember, in the 1700s, before modern farming technology and things like that, he was talking about villages of people that would over-reproduce, and they'd reproduce too many offspring, and they didn't have enough land to farm or graze their animals, and it would cause a decrease in the population. There would be starvation in that village. Well, Darwin read Malthus's work and noticed that it's not just humans, that every organism that's alive has the capability of over-reproducing, to where there is a massive die-off in offspring. Right? And that's what part of his book that he wrote in 1859 on the origins of species by natural selection, that's part of where that came from. That's part of where that information came from, was from Malthus's work on humans, and then his realization that it's not just humans. All organisms can do this, and they do. So animals give birth to more young than individuals that will survive. Okay? Now, the great thing about that is it plays right into natural selection. No two offspring are the same unless they're identical twins, but that's rare in most organisms. So your offspring are going to be different. They're going to have different genetic traits, and you produce a bunch of them, and some of them are going to be better suited for the current environment. So you might have over-reproduced. You produced too many offspring. Some of them are going to die, but some of them are going to be suited for the current environment. And that's where natural selection comes into play. So we can talk about things like sockeye salmon, Oncorhynchus nerca. Okay? Let's say a female produces 3,000 eggs. Okay? And it really depends on the size of the female. I mean, they can produce way more than 3,000 eggs, but just for purposes of kind of this example, 3,000 eggs. Okay? Let's say the majority of them die as either eggs or small fish. So 2,970 die as eggs or small fish in the freshwater system. Okay? So that means 30 of the original 3,000 eggs make it to the ocean. Well, the offspring make it to the ocean. By that time, once they enter the ocean, they're called smolt. Okay? So they go into the ocean go through an event called smoltification, where the organism's kidneys now have the capability of dealing with high salt content versus low salt content. And we'll talk more about this as we talk about fish and what's going on with their osmoregulation. But so 30 will enter, go through the smoltification process. But while that, in the ocean, during typically with sockeye salmon, it's about a 4-year period before they're going to come back to spawn. It depends on the stream and things like that, but most of the time it's around that 4-year mark. During the 4 years, 24 of the original 30 that made it die. So then you have 6 individuals that are entering the river as adults. Okay, remember that as a salmon, majority of salmon, as they enter the river, enter the fresh water, they can only go through that smoltification event once. Most species, okay, not all, but they can only go through that event once. Okay, and once they start entering the freshwater system, their salt content in their body is so rich that the fresh water just starts rushing into their cells, and they start kind of filling up, exploding, and they start rotting and dying. Okay, so 6 enter the river system, and they're going to go to spawn. As they're entering the river system, 3 are caught by commercial or sport fishermen. Okay, so 3 of the original 30 that made it to the ocean are now caught, consumed, or whatever they're done with, put in a freezer and then thrown out in 6 months. 3 reach the spawning ground. Okay? But remember, just because you reach the spawning ground doesn't mean that you're going to spawn. So let's say 1 gets consumed by a bear, eagle, raccoon, something comes by and eats it before it spawns. Okay? And 2 spawn to replace themselves. Okay? This is what population dynamics does for us. Okay? All we need is 2 out of the original 3,000 eggs to make it back and spawn, and the population is stable. The population is not increasing or decreasing. Okay? If only 1 makes it back, though, now you have a decrease. If you have 3 that make it back and spawn, now you have an increase. Okay? So often, as a fish and wildlife manager, it's a numbers game. That's what we're interested in, is numbers. Okay, so let's look at some examples of this really quick, and you're going to get some examples. You're going to get to practice this, but we're going to look at some different types of growth. Okay, so let's talk about logistic growth. Okay, it's a simple equation. Triangle N, that means change in N, so change in the population, divided by change in T, or change in time. Okay, that's equal to the rate of growth times the population size. Okay, so change in number, change in time, the maximum potential growth rate. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the future. Okay, maximum potential growth rate is just how many is the absolute max that you could reproduce. Okay, and then the number of individuals in the current population. Okay. We can run through this real quick, and I'll just give you an example. Let's say the rate of growth is 0.25, or about a quarter of the individuals in the population. Let's say the population was 50. Okay. We do that, the new population is 50 plus 12 and a half. Okay. Clearly, we're not going to have a half of an individual, but this give or take some. Okay. So you're adding 12 and a half individuals to the population, okay, from this reproductive event. Now, maybe this reproductive event happens once a year. Or maybe we're talking about an organism that has the capability of reproducing multiple times a year. So it just depends. And you might say, well, what organism could you consume that reproduces multiple times a year? Lots. In the fisheries industry, shrimp, okay, crabs, lobster in certain regions can reproduce, clams, mussels, these kind of things can reproduce multiple times per year. Even some fish species And if we look in the tropics, they can reproduce multiple times per year. Okay? All right. So again, like I said, after year 1 or whatever time 1, okay, your population is now 62.5 individuals. Okay? If we throw this on an Excel spreadsheet, okay, which you guys will get a chance to do in a later assignment, you can throw it on there. You can see that the rate of change, or the growth rate, doesn't change. This is a logistic growth rate curve. Okay. The original population is 50, okay? And you can see after about 20 generations or 20 births, okay, the new population is 3,469 individuals. When you started at 50, okay, and over 20 generations, you've added that many individuals to the population. Okay? That's pretty good growth, and this is what it looks like. It's called, an exponential growth curve. It's a J growth curve, and it just keeps going up. And as long as the population can handle it, okay, this curve will just keep going up and up and up and up. Okay? The thing that I want to stress in this lecture, and we'll stress it again in a further lecture. Next lecture, I'll talk a little more in depth about some of these issues, okay, is that most populations don't fit this curve for very long. Because what populations will do, so again, that's exponential growth. Okay, that's an exponential growth curve. Okay? What most populations will do, so this is exponential growth, they'll reach what we call a K, or a carrying capacity. They'll reach a point where the number of individuals in a population, or the habitat, or the food, or the water, or something will limit the number of individuals in a population. So they'll sit at K. But in actuality, they normally don't sit at K. So it's not like once a population reaches carrying capacity, they just stay and they maintain. In this case, they maintain 400,000 individuals. That's not really what it is. Okay? They really start doing this. Okay, they get up there and maybe they squeak over the 400,000, they crash, they rebound to the 400,000, they crash, and they go back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes they go way over the 400,000 and you get a huge crash or a huge reduction in the population, and it goes back and forth. Okay, most populations bounce around whatever their carrying capacity is. Okay? Sometimes going over, sometimes crashing back below it. Okay? But again, carrying capacity itself can change. And you don't have to imagine this. Let's say food resources is what's limiting the number of individuals in a given population. How much food there is. Okay? Well, let's say there's a drought and there's less plants. Okay? Right there, your carrying capacity just decreased. Your food availability just decreased. So now maybe your carrying capacity is 300,000 versus 400,000. So you're going to expect to see a crash in that population to go below that carrying capacity. Okay? Let's say a new species was introduced to an environment and it eats the same resources as this population. Again, you might have a crash. Or a new species was introduced and it's food for this population. Now you might have an increase in the carrying capacity. Or maybe, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, BLM, maybe they bought a chunk of land and they've connected corridors that were once, broken up by privately owned land, and now it's open, public land, and those populations can move through fences, and there's not cattle grazing going on or sheep grazing or something like that, and these organisms can move back and forth now. Okay? Again, that could increase the carrying capacity. These kind of things will switch a population from an exponential growth curve to what we call a logistic growth curve. So this is a J curve. Exponential is a J curve. Okay, logistic is a S curve. Okay. So one last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to growth curves, at least initially what I want to talk about when it comes to growth curves, is again, carrying capacity is whatever the top of the growth curve is. Okay, so the maximum uh, number of individuals that can occupy a given area at a given time due to some limit in resources. And then something that's really important for fishery scientists, and that is what's called the MSY, or the maximum sustainable yield, or it's calculated by finding the inflection point. The inflection point is half of the carrying capacity. So if the carrying capacity is 400,000, half the carrying capacity is 200,000. This is the fastest rate of growth of a population. And that's what we call the maximum sustainable yield. So most fisheries, shrimping industry, lobster, clam, salmon, tuna, whatever it might be that we're consuming, most fisheries want to be at this point. Okay? And I'll talk about that more in a later lecture. Why do we want to be at the maximum sustainable yield point? Okay? We'll talk about that, and I'll give you some more insight on future assignments that you're going to have to do when you get to calculate what's the carrying capacity and the growth rate and the maximum sustainable yield of a population. Okay? So next time, more population dynamics, and